Boy, good grief, am I right? I forgot what a powerful contraceptive that movie is. My man's getting nothing tonight. Anyway, hi, welcome. Thank you for staying for the panel, and thank you for attending this inaugural screening of this wonderful series that Jessica has put together about women-led horror. I'd like to introduce our guests real quick, but once more, I'm Andrea Subasati. I'm the executive editor of Rue Morgue magazine, celebrating 25 years in print this year. Woohoo! Sarah Ty Black, all the way on the end there, is an arts curator, a film programmer, and critic. You might have seen their bylines for such outlets as the LA Times, the Globe and Mail, and CinemaScope. And then right next to me, we have Carolyn Morissette, who is a critic and programmer for the Blood in the Snow Film Festival, as well as the Fantasia Film Festival, and a podcaster, co-host of the Really Melanated podcast, which focuses on Black creators and programmers. Applause. So thank you so much for joining me, guys. And the reason I wanted to invite critics and programmers for this panel as opposed to filmmakers is because I feel like the topic of women-led horror cinema is a much wider topic than just the idea of who's making the films. And I know for myself in my career, I have had to defend the reasons why women are allowed to enjoy horror films, why that's not a contradiction, why that's not a weird, I don't know. And not only can women enjoy films, but they can make films, and they can make films about a wide variety of topics. So I just kind of want to address the wider discourse around this subject. So let's start there. Let's kick things off with that. I'd like to hear each of your thoughts on how women-led horror is received and discussed in the horror community. Like, what would you say is the current state of affairs of that topic?
After you, my dear. Well, I think it's discussed more, and I think that people are making space for it now. I think it's really important that it needs to be discussed because women have a perspective that is really important, and I think a lot of times women and people who identify as women, a lot of the times we have to live in fear, right? So we deal with horror a lot just in our lives. So I think it's a really important perspective to open up the space to.
Yeah, and I think for everyone generally, horror often functions as this kind of release. Like I'm a fraidy cat, but I love being scared in this kind of controlled environment. And I think when you introduce elements of gender, elements of anything, in terms of your own individual experience, it becomes really potent in that way. And I'm glad that we're seeing more and more work that focuses on the lives of women, that is made by women. I hope we can kind of get beyond where the mainstream discourse is kind of led to right now, which I think is very white women-centric. It's very cis women-centric. And don't get me wrong, I love those films, but there was also the era of like TIFF, when it was the female body itself was monstrous, which I love, but it's also very as a non-binary person, it's very estranging myself for my own estrangement kind of thing. So yeah, I'm really excited to see where it goes. We were talking a little bit earlier about kind of the social dynamics of the horror community and how I forget that men exist. So in my mind, it's this has always kind of been happening, and it's the same with Black horror, especially those are the folks that I turn to, and that's the kind of things that I myself enjoy. So sometimes I forget that that's not the case across the board.
I mean, that's wonderful. I love to hear that because, of course, I think we can remember when that wasn't the case. And we can remember how hard it was to make space for these kinds of conversations. And I can remember, I think it was about 12 years ago when Hannah Foreman started Women in Horror Month. She kind of declared February Women in Horror Month, and there was this big backlash within the horror community where, of course, there's the people who are going to be like, well, we observe women in horror all year long, so we don't need that, that old chestnut. And certainly I wonder, nowadays I haven't heard any vocal opposition to programming like this. Something like this is celebrated. So I guess my question to you guys is to what extent is that attitude still around?
I mean, using the Women in Horror Month as an example, I think that as a Black femme, as someone sitting beside a wonderful Black woman, I think that that example encapsulates like the two kind of feelings that govern the experience of Black femmes and Black women in horror, where it's like, okay, cool, Women in Horror Month, yes, and then it's like, no, they put it on Black History Month. You know, it's like that's such an oversight. You know, everyone knows February is Black History Month, but then on the other side, there's like that pushback, not in terms of that criticism, but in terms of we celebrate women all year. It's like it's simply not true, first of all, and it's nice to have a sense of community and event around it, because it is something that should be celebrated, because it has been historically underrepresented for so long. You know, as long as we're not falling into the kind of tokenizing discourse. I don't know if there's any other Black folks here, but like once January like 20th comes around, the inbox starts filling up with all these Black History Month requests. I'm not about that, but I am about, you know, finding this common space where we can talk in our own kind of language without having to explain or without having to feel othered.
I think so. Women in Horror Month is great. I find but it focuses on women characters in horror more so than women directors, and I think that there needs to be a shift for that. And I find like on social media, women directors are more vocal now about what they do, because there's another thing that women are often, I guess, raised to not speak up and to kind of just toe the line and just kind of be, you know, a quiet woman. And I mean, I was raised like that. I was raised not to speak up. So you have to unlearn that. And I find specifically with women directors, because there's statistics that show that there aren't enough women directors, women of color directors, and Black women directors. Like, that's always an uphill climb. So I think that Women in Horror Month is great to focus. I agree with Sarah, like just that the month might be kind of problematic. However, it also is a moment to shine spotlight on Black creators and Black horror characters. So, I mean, there is that too.
No, I hear you, because I remember when Women in Horror Month came out and everybody was like, yay, Scream Queens, yay, Ripley, yay, Jamie Lee Curtis, and yay, strong female characters, okay. But, you know, there's such a big wide world between movies like that and movies like the one we just saw, which is speaking to, I guess, not that specific a context. I guess the idea of being isolated and cooped up with annoying kids is something we know a thing or two about after the last 2 years. But there are anxieties and fears and experiences that are specific to the feminine experience, to women of color, to queer women. And, you know, the more stories we have with these women behind the camera, the more we can experience that. So along those same lines, I remember when I was getting started in horror journalism, I would always be invited to speak about women in horror. I would always be invited to, what's your favorite final girl? What's your, like, I was so happy to have earned a seat at the table, but it still kind of felt like the kids' table. And so I want to throw that out to you. You're both very established in your careers and in furthering these conversations. Do you still have a sense of that women in horror is kind of a niche special interest group?
I don't personally believe it's a niche special interest group, but I feel like the way that women especially, and we're sort of getting to the era of like other marginalized gendered folks being tokenized in a similar way. I think that it is a way to really conveniently exclude us from more nuanced conversations. You know, it's I would love if people would invite me to more horror panels. I don't have that problem because everyone sees me as the Black film person, which is not horror. That's another panel. So I would love it. If you want me on a horror panel, take me there. But I experienced that in other contexts. But yeah, it is a way of like shoehorning in this kind of narrative that things are forward facing, that change is coming, but in the way that it's happening, it's not actually doing that at all, you know. And as I was kind of saying earlier, that's why I really am drawn to like these kind of social spaces where we live with that specificity rather than having to kind of be on the margins of a presupposed center. That's what I think.
Thank you.
Well, I think there are organizations that have always been inclusive and will ask, a broad range of people to talk about horror and be inclusive. And then there are some that still need work, and they feel like now they need to catch up with the other organizations. They're like, hey, do you want to talk about horror? You're a Black woman in horror. You want to talk? Like, sure. I mean, like, I program for 2 horror film festivals. They're established, and sure, I'll talk. And there's I don't know. I can't remember if I was listening to a podcast or there was something on TV, and someone was saying that basically, even if you're asked to do something and the intention isn't sincere, still do it. And like, if you're some dude that doesn't like the fact that I'm programming for 2 horror film festivals, but you have to ask me to talk about it, I'll do it. I'll do it. And I think that there's kind of a gap that needs to be, filled or kind of bridged, so that, like as Sarah's saying, like, we need to kind of just throw ourselves into the water and just dive in and talk about horror wherever we can, just so that we represent ourselves, I guess. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Take
I
up
would
space.
like to add like just one thing that I was thinking
Please.
about while you were talking, Carolyn, because I think obviously we met because we have similar interests and similar positionings, but you're a lot more embedded in the horror community than I am by choice. And I salute you for that hard work that you do. But I think also about how like me and you have never been on a panel together. That's too many, It's this tokenizing actually robs us of our own ability to speak with each other. It singles us out as individuals who are just a voice other than sharing our knowledge and sharing our experiences with one another. And I think that can actually be really isolating and sometimes a more insidious function of the type of spaces that are doing these type of things. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Jessica, you're going to flag me when I'm running out of time, right? I have more questions for these 2, but if you guys have any, feel free to put up your hand. And there's one that goes up right away. There's always one.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and talking. I love getting to talk. Here's you can talk about movies. I wanted to ask if I could get each of you maybe if there's a filmmaker that you think kind of fits in this category that you want to like really passionate about, that you want people to go and check more of their films out. Like a not guy filmmaker making horror, not specifying just women, but that would be great. But I also wanted to ask, my favorite part about the Babadook is that Babadook is not killed. Babadook gets to live in the basement, works through what it's working through. Is there a monster that you would love to keep in your basement to take care of from cinematic history? This is a weird question.
No, I love it. I'm like, you can't see my eyes, but I'm like, who planted you here? I love this. I would love to repeat the question, but I am not a neurotypical person.
No problem. So the first part of your question is actually a question I wanted to ask, so I'm going to come back to that. But the second part was with regard to the Babadook specifically, are there any monsters in your basement or that you would like to keep in your basement? Is that paraphrasing correctly?
I mean, besides myself, a lot of the kind of monsters on screen that I'm interested in are this kind of grotesque feminine. So I really like the sexy gremlin from Gremlins 2, the new batch. I love things like this where it's like the kernel was like a conventional femininity and it got distorted through like concentrated adding on. I think that's also like, as a queer person, we just identify with the villain in horror films for very obvious reasons. So I'm having trouble like pinning it down to just one because I'm very pro monster, pro like ugly thing. I feel like that's also like how gay Babadook happened. We're all like, yes, same, very gender affirming, yes. None of us were identifying with the mom or the son. We're like, that's me right there. Can't help myself. I'm trying to think. Maybe I'll come back to you with more. I just have the sexy lady gremlin. I don't know. I'll have to look at my body. I'm covered in tattoos of that type of ilk.
Yeah, we can get to horror tattoos in a second. Carolyn, you got anything?
Yeah, I'm just going to kick it old school and say Godzilla because, like, cranky ass Godzilla, though. Like, the cranky Godzilla that's like, you woke me up for this? Like, because I would feed Godzilla snacks and I'd let it sleep. And I don't know, I love Godzilla. So 100% Godzilla. How many times I say Godzilla?
5 times and he'll show up. We were actually talking in the green room before the film about what the horror community is and how we kind of construe the horror community. And so I think the monster in my basement is probably Twitter. You know what I mean? Like, you take a look every so often and it's like, whoa! And sometimes it's quiet today and I can walk away. And other times it fucks me up. But
Candyman. Ooh. I'm going to heal Candyman's inner child.
But to piggyback on the second part of your question, I think it's a great question, and I did also want to highlight that that while there are a lot of women making horror movies that address gendered stuff, there's also a lot of women horror filmmakers who are making other stuff too. And I think, it's important that women aren't kind of pigeonholed into into feeling like they only can tell stories about motherhood and assault and trauma. So I was actually going to ask you guys if you could spit out a couple of titles, a couple of examples of this, both good and bad. What was that? Did Shadow of a Doubt? Shadow in the Cloud. I don't know that one. Who made that? Oh.
Oh, the Gremlin film. Yeah. TIFF a few years ago.
Haven't seen it, but cool, great. I'll put it on my list.
Well, so it was Midnight Madness when there's only 3 films in Midnight Madness. Yeah. 2020.
Might as well have been 2000. I don't know.
What is time? Did you guys have any?
A comfort one that I often go back to that I think is exploring questions of how gender becomes practiced socially, but is not explicitly like, this is my feminist film because that's the only film that they'll allow me to make, is The Invitation. It's weird that it's like a comfort watch for me. I think like that's a really good example of a film that is not just, because I don't want to watch a film where we focus in on a woman character at the expense of everyone else. The goal here is full breadth for everyone, unless we're working in like some kind of like campy kind of form or mode. But I really like that as kind of a study of so many things outside of just character, just like horror and suspense. I'll think of more while we continue to chat.
Okay.
I had to write mine down because I can't remember anything.
Yeah, I'm like, and I looked and then I forgot when I started talking. Jesus Christ.
Okay, so I have 2. Okay, so one is, I believe it's a 2012 film called Helter Skelter by Mika Ninagawa. And it's a Japanese film, kind of, it's like a body horror, but not like a body horror adjacent. And it's about this schoolgirl who doesn't think she's attractive, and she goes through this whole transformation and becomes this pop star, and she's just despicable. It's based on a manga, and it's like she's just a horrible character, but you kind of want to see where she goes. And that movie has stuck with me for a very long time. And I actually, oh my God, I think my partner actually tracked it down on DVD. I'm like, I must have it. And it's little known. I have to throw out a bit of obscure film, nerdiness here, but
Prove yourself.
Yeah, exactly. But I really love that film because that character is so, she changes herself to survive. And I just love that aspect of that character. And okay, so I'm gonna try and pronounce her name properly. Lucille Hadzihalovich, and she did Evolution and Earwig. I believe Earwig played TIFF as well, and her vision is so unique and weird, and she's kind of body horror as well. And Earwig, I don't even think I could describe it to you. Anybody who's seen it, I can't describe
That's
it to you.
how everyone tried to describe it to me.
Yeah.
That's why I want to see it.
Yeah, right? And so I love that film, and I would love to get my hands on like a box set of her films. So anyway.
Make it happen. And Sarah Ty, the invitation you were talking about, the Karin Kusama one about that dinner
Yes,
party. Okay.
yes.
'Cause I think another one came out.
I think because it's like me disidentifying with it. Like I think there's like there's one black woman in it, I think. But anyways, it's just like what I see. When I see white people, I'm like, interesting. Something is going on here and no one has any clue. It's like my own like counter reading of its own kind of counter narrative.
That's valid. Any other questions from the audience? Or we can go back to mine. There's one right here in front.
So I would 100% agree that we need more queer and female voices in movies. I just would like to get a bit more concrete. So if, like, what do you think has to change structurally? So if I were to call, like, my local representative and ask for some specific policies, what do you think would help to further that goal?
I mean, I'm not a policy.
I'm just going to repeat the question real
sorry.
quick. The question is, again, like straight out of my notes, is like, what can the movie-loving public do? There's clearly a lot more work to be done in terms of representation with regard to women in color and queer representation in horror films. So what can the movie-loving public do to help support your efforts in that? Is that fair?
Maybe not. My answer is maybe not about movie-going public, but just as a movie watcher, as a critic, I think that this kind of scramble for representation has landed us in a bit of a tough spot where there are a lot of stories that don't really have integrity or complexity or nuance to them. I'm not alone in being one of the many black critics online who is often talking about how we're in a flop era for black filmmaking, which I think is that mode of representational cinema that has become the most scrambled at, for lack of a better word. But it's, as I said, like it's across the board. Like I remember seeing the trailer for They Them, like as a They Them myself, and I was like, oh my God, can we not do this? Like I think what I want to see is more queer and trans folks behind and in front of the camera, more Black, Indigenous people of color behind in front of the camera, but with integrity, with stories that maybe don't need to be so legible, that don't need to be so translative or pedantic or semantic, and like a kind of, isn't it great we're doing this? And I think that, you know, I just want more good movies, and without having to trade that at the expense of so-called representation.
I think as a programmer, I make it a point of, I seek out films that offer representation, and I'm very very detailed. I will look and say, will that offend someone? Will that offend someone? Will that offend someone? Like I'm always like making, you know, I have a little checklist. And sometimes, you know, a problematic thing is in a film because there's a point to be made. So there's that. But for whatever film that I program, if it's by a trans filmmaker, someone who's non-binary, has a non-binary character, I would say for the film-going, you know, populace to go and see the films, go to the film festivals, support the films, because that's how the underrepresented filmmakers get the buzz going about their films. And seek it out. There's a lot of film festivals out there run by women or is part of the like Inside Out, the queer community. I would say support the film festivals that program these films, because otherwise no one's gonna see them, you know?
Yeah, I think a lot of that about being an audience member, I say, like as a critic and as a programmer, is not waiting for like the next big thing. Like go to quote unquote niche festivals, go to niche screenings, because that's where you're going to find what you want. Like, you don't have to wait for everybody to want to see it. That's not how film has ever been for anyone who isn't like a white man or a white woman.
Like, the question wasn't really directed to me, but I would also like to add to make space and maybe not, intrude upon conversations that aren't about you. Something else that we were talking about in the green room with regard to Twitter. Just think twice before you hit send, before you get into slap fights about representation about groups to which you don't belong.
Can I add to that as well?
Please.
Yeah, like
I'm setting you up, girl.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of conversations, like, again, the Women in Horror Month and it occurring during February. There are a lot of people who are getting into the argument that really shouldn't have been in the conversation because it's a conversation for Black creators to talk about. So, yeah, taking from that, and along that lines, if you're unsure about something, like, I guess, even though you want to ask the question, it might not be posited in the right way. So maybe just kind of read and absorb what people are saying,
Google
I guess.
is free.
Yeah, exactly. Absorb, look it up, but it's, yeah, like, I guess that's all I want to say.
Love it. We're good? Okay. More questions from the audience for these two? Sean. Oh, were you?
Okay, well, this is kind of like relates to women horror kind of a roundabout way because I was just curious about. Well, it's actually from the Scream 5 from earlier this year kind of lumped the Babadook into the whole category of elevated horror. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on elevated horror and how it relates to women in film?
Okay, I'm just going to repeat that for some reason. He's asking what we think of the term elevated horror and how recently in the new Scream movie, Babadook was lumped in there. So how does, yeah. I can't do that because I'm holding a mic, but I'm trying. Air quotes.
Hate it. Loser category for losers. I think it just gives people an excuse to watch movies that they would have otherwise been ashamed to watch before. That's very much not my MO. I think as someone who, like, I program everything, not at one place, but I program in different venues. So, like, if I'm working at, like, an avant-garde experimental moving image festival, there's this expectation that I'm not going home at the end of the night to watch all the saws. I am. And what I'm interested in is kind of doing away with those hierarchies. And I love when that kind of cross-mixing happens, which is exactly why I hate the category of elevated horror. I am distrustful of A24, despite my love of some movies. There's a branding being very purposefully manifested that I think is very elitist, and it looks down on people for just enjoying what they enjoy. And horror doesn't have to be this thing that proves itself. It can just be like some guy's head explodes and you're like, oh fuck yes, like, and I just really enjoy all sorts of things, and I hate that we have to categorize it, or to get some sort of critical attention needs to be serious, because I'm very much not a serious person, but sometimes I enjoy serious things. So
I would bring up, so these so-called elevated films like Hereditary, for instance, right? So where was Toni Collette's Oscar, right? And Essie Davis, like, they knocked themselves out in these roles, but like, where's their awards? So they could say like it's elevated, but they're still gonna like throw, the horror films in the trash. And I love every single horror film. Like, it doesn't matter if it's a B, D, F movie. I love it all. And I agree with Sarah. There shouldn't be a hierarchy. You can't, like, I'm so tired of hearing that elevated horror phrase, because horror is horror. And I love watching like some really janky special effects, or like someone's got like a hand puppet monster. I love it. And then sometimes, I'll watch like Martyrs or Hereditary. Those are my comfort films. Sorry, I'm a bit of a psycho.
That's it. That's it. Martyrs is our comfort film. That's why we met. That's how we met.
That's right, right? But yeah, I disagree with elevated horror. So yeah, that's a great question.
What's the goat one? The witch.
The witch.
The
Yes.
witch. So when it's like the goat, it's a goat, right? The
Yeah.
goat is like,
Yeah,
would-
yeah.
Black Phillip is like, wouldst thou like to live deliciously? I was sitting in the theater and I laughed so fucking hard. And I've never received so many bad looks in my life. I'm like, this can't be the point if I'm not allowed to laugh at that. This just can't be why we're here.
Well, the last year there was Lamb.
Yeah.
Which is,
Yes.
but that's lumped into horror, but I watched it as more like a dark fantasy than horror.
Yeah.
All right, guys, we're out of time. I would love to talk horror all night long. I want to thank our panelists. And before you clap, wait. What are you guys doing next? Where can these guys find you? Let's continue the conversation. Not on Twitter.
Don't find me. You can find me on Twitter. My Twitter is where I go to be public. It's just Sarah Ty. You can find me writing at the Globe and Mail. If you're my mean commenter who's been following me for a year, do not try and find me.
Come find me.
I have like a bit of a shrill thing going on with an M. McGinty. If you're here, M. McGinty, I don't want to talk to you. Or the LA Times. I write actually a lot about horror, but no one wants to acknowledge that.
Blood in the Snow is happening November the 21st to the 26th. So that's the film. I'm one of the programmers for that film festival. So that's coming up. Come out for that. Also we have a horror lab for underrepresented filmmakers. So that is going to be happening during Blood in the Snow. So we'll be doing that, and you can find me. Oh my God, I'm rarely on Twitter, and all I do is retweet, and nobody likes my tweets anyway. So I'm at VFD Pixie. And what else am I doing? I don't know.
Oh, that's enough, girl.
Yeah, I think
You
that's
definitely
it. Yeah.
can't like go to any horror thing in the city and not see Karen. It's a very different vibe here. Like you're gonna see her if you want to see her.
I guess. Yeah. Well, when I'm not hugging my cats.
Thank you, Sarah Ty. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Jessica. Read Rue Morgue. Happy Halloween.